Thank you, Tim. Let me start with a question this morning. How would you describe God? So I want you to, if you're a parent, maybe you've actually had this experience, and if you're not a parent, I just want you to imagine some young child, I don't know, 4, 5, 6, walks up to you, tugs your shirt, and says, "Excuse me, sir, would you describe God?" Or they walk up to you, "Excuse me, ma'am, would you describe God?" Go. Just imagine for just a second. We won't do it out loud, but I want you to imagine in your head. Go ahead, start describing God to that child. Probably there's one word that's dominating this current conversation. The word like. Well, you see, young man, God is, well, he's like, well, let me describe him like this. Perhaps, do you find yourself reaching for metaphor, analogy, illustration? How much concrete is coming out? Now I want you to imagine that child walking away from you. You just had a brief conversation. You attempted to answer the question by describing God. How many of you have the feeling right now of, crushed it? How many like that's the feeling? That kid totally knows who God is now. Anybody else want to hear? Anybody have that feeling? There might be a few of you. Anybody have the feeling of like, I don't know if I helped that child at all? This is hard, right? Well, I want to kick this thing off. This is a brand new series today. I want to kick this off with a passage from Scripture in a book. It's a story about a man who had a book named after him. His name is Ezekiel, and he's called a prophet. He had some very specific and interesting conversations with God. He's in a period of history, in Jewish history, where he has been deported. His country has been overtaken, and he is now a prisoner in another country. So he's a prisoner of war. However, he's not in a jail. They're basically saying, hey, you have now limited freedoms, but go ahead and live your life under a new ruling power. You can have your faith, and it can be expressed in certain limits under this ruling power as we integrate you into our way of being. Ezekiel has the difficult job of trying to remind God's people, his fellow men, that they're not to forget about the origin of all of life, that they're actually not meant to forget who they're supposed to give their allegiance to, because the nature of this society and blending into a new world meant that many of them were forgetting their heritage. Ezekiel has a moment with God. He has a vision. I don't know if he smoked anything or ate anything, but he has a vision. And it's a powerful vision, and we get it in Ezekiel chapter 1, verse 26. And I'm going to read from the Bible right here. So I meant to bring my glass. I usually use an iPad because I don't even have glasses. Now I'm like, this is what happens when you get old. And then they stood with folded wings. I'm picking this up kind of in the middle of the vision. And then as they stood with folded wings, there was a voice from above the dome over their heads. Now, as I get into this, I want you to listen to Ezekiel attempting to describe God. Above the dome, there was something that looked like a throne, sky blue, like a sapphire, with a human-like figure towering above the throne. And from what I could see, from the waist up, he looked like burnished bronze. And from the waist down, like maybe a blazing fire. Brightness everywhere, the way a rainbow springs out of the day, out of the sky on a rainy day. That's what it was like. Well, it turned out this is the glory of God. When I saw this, I fell to my knees, my face to the ground, and then I heard a voice. It said, "Son of man, stand up." Now here, there's something dignifying in this statement. You don't get to stay on the ground with me. Stand up. I have something to say to you. And the moment I heard the voice, the Spirit entered me and put me on my feet. And as he spoke to me, I listened. Here's a man in this book we call the Bible who's trying to do the same thing I tried to have you walk through. Language God. And this man had a real specific vision. I mean, he caught up kind of in almost like when we might say an out-of-body experience. There was this, it was like he was immersed in another reality. He had this ability to see something, and yet his words were limited. Language wasn't enough. And all he could do was keep using the word like. Well, it's kind of a bluish thing, maybe like a sapphire. It's fiery, maybe kind of like a bronze-looking thing. And the person I'm talking to has a human-like quality about him. And to me, I hope when you hear that, there's a word of encouragement. Because we're all attempting to language God. And none of us actually get to do it perfectly. As a matter of fact, the reason, the minute we go, I now have God figured out, is the minute we have created an idol. Because God is a deep, deep mystery. And for those of you who've spent some time getting to know him, you discover the more you know him, the less you know. This is the nature of mystery. Well, if this is true about God, I think it's fair to say this is also true about God's book, about his story. This right here is God's journal. It's an anthology of books, 66 books set together over about 1,000 years by lots of different people writing in lots of different cultures and a lot of different contexts. There's different genres to this book. You actually can't read it the same way. It's meant to be read differently because one part of the book is poetry, another part of the book is history. The way it's even set up is designed to be read differently. And yet, you and I have been told a lot of things about this book. I have. I grew up, started going to church in gestation. I was born into the home of a teacher who became a pastor, who became a counselor, and perhaps if you have a story like mine, I just went to church from the time I can remember. In my church experience, we really liked going to church, so we had a morning Sunday school hour and where I studied the Bible, and then we would go to a church service where we studied the Bible. Then Sunday night, which was a bit of a bummer because I couldn't watch the $6 Million Man, we also went to church at night. Sunday morning, Sunday night. Then we also had Tuesday night Bible studies, and we had a Wednesday night thing, which I think was a prayer thing, but food was always involved. When I was in 3rd grade, my parents put me in a private Christian school, so the school was really into having chapel services where we studied the Bible. We also had Bible classes, so I got to study the Bible there too. So to sum up, on Sunday I studied from the Bible 3 times. On Monday we had chapel service 1 time. Tuesday was Bible class. Wednesday night I went to church, kids' church or a youth group, so I got the Bible on Wednesday night. Thursday was Bible class. Friday and Saturday were preserved for Knight Rider and Airwolf. That was my childhood. At 18 years old, I went off to a Christian university and decided my major would be in church ministries. Isn't that great? So now I got to have classes where I studied the Bible. And this school in particular loved to have chapel services where we studied the Bible on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. We also had Sunday morning Sunday school and Sunday morning church services and Sunday night services and Wednesday night services. So to sum up, I studied the Bible 3 times on Sunday, 3 times on Monday, twice on Tuesday, 3 times on Wednesday, twice on Thursday. Friday, I was breaking the rules. After going to the university, I went into ministry. The very first job I took actually was part-time as a soccer coach and a Bible teacher. And after I did that for a few years, I did youth ministry full-time, where I had to now teach from the Bible and have programs what I did for teenagers with the Bible. I did that for 13 years. Then 14 years ago, I believed God was calling me to plant a church. And I discovered that now suddenly I was responsible for a weekly research project that I was meant to write and deliver called a sermon. It was meant to center on the Bible. To sum up, I've spent some time with the Bible in my last 50 years, and to sum up, I'm still fascinated by it. I still love this book. Throughout the course of my life, in different seasons more than others, I've actually spent daily time with this book, and it's framed my understanding of reality. Sometimes it's set my intent for the day, but other times it's reflected on the day's experiences. I'm fascinated, now more than ever, on how other sciences, we talked about this last week with Kevin, how the sciences actually, to me, are not a contrast to this book, but actually underscore its truth. So I've broadened my study now to sociology and psychology. I'm interested in economics. I'm interested in quantum physics. Why? Because when I hang out with a lot of skeptics in my life, there are all these questions about the Bible. And it's become fascinating for me to not just proof text the Bible with the Bible, but to actually go, in the grand scheme of human experiences, I think everything is pointing to the truth that's being revealed in this book. So when I study these other sciences, they're not contradictory for me like I was told for most of my life, but instead they reinforce what I see to be true. One last thing about the Bible. Sometimes when I open up this book, I look at the words and it's boring. I'm like, yeah, I think this is over-familiarity. I'm getting nothing out of it. Other times, I read the book and I'm like, yeah, I've heard that 1,000 times. That's probably a good reminder for me today. Other times, it explodes off the pages with depth and revelation and blows my mind. I'm often intimidated and usually in awe. I have a love for this book. I'm grateful for it. It's functioned as the center of my orientation for existence for my 50 years. The book has been at times a stumbling block for me, and at other times it's been an idol. I'll tell you when it's most often an idol for me. When I want to find my certainty in it instead of using it to get to God. David Benner writes, "Nothing is more dangerous than presuming that we already see when we do not." Another way of saying this is, the greatest barrier to success is not ignorance, but the illusion of knowing. When you grow up around the Bible, as I have, there's a temptation to think, I've seen it all, I've read it all, I've heard it all. That temptation was blown up for me a long time ago. I'm not actually tempted there much, because the more I get to know God, the deeper the mystery, as we referenced in the beginning. But the thing I will find is that I'm drawn towards some of the basic needs in my life, and some of those needs actually get in the way when I see this book through the lens of certain needs. This book can either become a pathway to the person of God, or it can become the greatest obstacle. Because the moment we use this as the end, the moment this book becomes something we wield to prove that we're right, is the moment we've lost our humility. It's the moment we plunge ourselves into the knowledge of good and evil, when we've actually been called to walk with God in the cool of the day. And so, for us to go into a series about the Bible, it seems like today should be maybe just an introduction. Maybe set the frame. Because if we don't, then our trajectory will be off for the next 3 months. So that's what I'd like to do for us. I like to remind us that there's really no viewpoint, there's only views from a point. We've all been shaped in our understanding of the nature of reality, all of us, by lots of different things. First and foremost, for those of you grown up in the West, you've grown up under a dominant understanding of the world as being right or wrong. If you grew up in the East, your dominant view of seeing the world was through shame and honor. And so shaming was a healthy mechanism to motivate you. Honor was a healthy mechanism to motivate you. And by the way, this tends to be very communal. Over here, if you grew up in the West, you tend to see things as right or wrong. This is right, this is wrong, what are the rules? And the rules only function one way. You obey the rules, you disobey the rules. I know this is obvious, but probably one of the things I should mention is this is not a Western book. Just to be clear. It's a Middle Eastern book written to Middle Eastern people and way more of a shame and honor culture than a right and wrong culture. Which is why, by the way, you're like, well, here's the rules, and the rules are necessary until they're not. And the person who breaks the rules the most, this guy named Jesus. You're not allowed to eat on the Sabbath. Okay. Walking through a grain field, disciples start eating stuff. Hey, whoa, time out. Rule says you're not supposed to eat on the Sabbath. Jesus is like, it's okay to break this rule. What? Yeah, the Sabbath, we're not made for the Sabbath. The Sabbath's made for us, so eat away. Huh? That's the rule. Generally. This happens over and over and over again in this book because it's written in a totally different context. In the West, we're like, no, but it's the rule. Some of you, depending on the bent of your personalities, as we walk into this series, might be a little bit more challenging than others. And a lot of that depends on personally how we've been shaped and formed. There are 6 basic needs to humanity, and we're going to talk about those in just a second because I actually think we bring those to the table when we open this book. But before we get to the needs, let's just talk about a couple other things, just to be obvious. In case we think we're purely objective creatures. Not only were you either born in a certain part of the world, most of you, I assume, were born in the West, and so you see the world through this right and wrong way of thinking. And we referenced this a little bit last week, too, especially on the backs of some of the early scholars who were translating this book out of the Hebrew and Aramaic and into Greek and then into Latin. And so it has this massive influence from Plato and Aristotle and from the Greeks, and so we're starting to see this thing through a Western lens, even though it wasn't written primarily to those in the West. But we start to see it that way, and then hundreds and hundreds of years later, it's shaping the way we understand the Bible. So let's acknowledge that. A lot of us just see it through a Western lens. The other thing is, you grew up in a certain part of the country. That affected the way you understand the nature of reality. The other thing is, you grew up in a certain home. By the way, most of you had your personalities formed before you were 2 or 3 years old. Right now, we're just tweaking. All the heavy lifting was done before you were 2. How you saw the world was being framed and shaped in that family of origin. Some of you are like, no kidding, I've been doing a lot of work trying to deal with that. Good. That's okay. But just acknowledge it. Though your trauma, your wound, all those things have shaped the way you see the world and thus the way you enter into this book. So let's be honest and walk forward, not with our eyes closed like there's this one way of seeing the Bible and I'm right. And I've arrived today to make sure all of you are right with me. Can you see it one baseline view, how that isn't even logical? It doesn't make any sense because it's not any of our perspectives. It's not any of our experiences. We all have a view from a point. So if we can come together under a spirit of humility and go, I've been shaped by so many factors. I should come to the Bible with a posture of humility. This has to set the frame for our next 3 months. If you walk in here with your arms folded, you're like, I heard you guys are doing a series on the Bible. Bible police. I haven't come for like 3 months, but I probably should be here. Because there could be like some heresy. If you came like that, I'm just going to tell you, this is probably going to be hellish for you. Which, by the way, we bless that. Because maybe that comes as your teacher. And this is how it relates to our 5 needs. I want to go quickly through, 6 needs, 6 central needs of humanity and how it shapes the way we see the world. First basic need of humanity is significance. Everyone has the need to feel special and feel chosen. It's wired into our DNA. There's something really healthy about these needs. Of course, there's always some way in which this need, if we don't take it to God or through God's plan, always leads us into suffering. So I'll give you that. So there's something beautiful about it, but significance, a good example of how that leads us into suffering, when the stories we tell ourselves, and we're always telling ourselves stories about our significance, when those stories just bolster the ego or medicate our pain, it just leads us into suffering. It often leads us into an endless game of comparison. So let me say this about significance, because in a minute I'm going to ask you, for these 6, which 2 are dominant? If significance is the most dominant need you deal with, and again, don't hear judgment, just hear this, we're just going to acknowledge what struggle might look like. If significance is your dominant need, then you're going to live with this constant sense of comparison and need for approval, and you should probably just go ahead and delete all social media right now. When you're done, you go, significance is definitely number 1, because this will be the struggle, okay? Number 2, we need love and connection. We're created to be in communion with God and unity with one another. That's the original design. And it offers us a sense of wholeness. But left in the flesh or in the ego self, it leads to suffering when we counterfeit love with lust or when we settle for connection instead of true vulnerability. There's a lot there. Number 3, growth. We are not deeply satisfied as humans unless our capacities are growing in some form or fashion. So we actually have this need for growth. Now, some of you might be like, well, I don't really like change. Well, you probably like growth. For instance, it probably wouldn't bother you if your bank account grew. There's something inside us that wants to grow somehow, right? There's a healthy piece to this. It leads to suffering, however, when we're preoccupied with growing and when it keeps us from being present with other people. We're just constantly focused on what's next, how we can be better. These are like, have you ever met somebody who's endlessly in school and you're like, you know what, sometime maybe you should get a job. No, I'm still studying. Growth is one of their needs. It just is gone sideways. All right, number 4, contribution. Another deeply spiritual need. We cannot be spiritually fulfilled without contributing to the lives of others. You're designed for contribution. If you're not serving someone or somewhere, if you're not giving of your resources, talents, and your money, if you're not giving something away, you're not contributing, there's something shriveling up in you. You're designed to contribute. So it leads to suffering most often when we close this off and we choose not to contribute to anybody, or when we contribute, but it just becomes a way of medicating or living in denial. And it's just really hidden to meet some other need on the list. And number 5, uncertainty. We actually have the need for uncertainty. The variety is the spice of life, right? So we have the need for variety and state change. This is actually a need. It leads us into suffering most often when we choose this at the expense of others and when it becomes of medicating or living in denial. Again, similar to contribution. Number 6, we have a need for certainty. All of us need this. We need some kind of stability somewhere. However, if it's the dominant need in your life, you will often present as a defensive person. When you consider these 6, if this goes, well, number 1 is probably certainty. Pay attention to see, do you get defensive quickly? The defensiveness is, I don't want anything to change. So don't say anything that might disrupt change. Don't do anything because I need steady. I need stable. Again, it's no judgment. Just pay attention if this is a dominant need. And by the way, for a lot of people, if certainty is their number 1 need, one of the places they tend to medicate most is in their belief system. Do not challenge the way I believe. It can't change, because if it does, for those whose certainty is the dominant need, if you pull the thread in their minds, the whole thing unravels. So it needs to stay the same. And now, again, there's a healthy part of that need. We need some stability. But pay attention to what happens when we come into suffering. All these needs are something that are important and central to who we are. And we bring these needs to this book when we open it up to read it. Let's pause right now. Which two needs would you say are the most dominant for you? Which of those two? If you had to go these two, and if you want to get crazy, pick the top three. But which ones would you say? These are the ones that probably, and by the way, this could have been different a year ago, but for now, today, these are probably the needs that I think I'm probably most attentive to. Let's go back to certainty for just a second, because that's going to relate a lot to our conversations in the coming months. What's the one thing we can be certain of? Above all, because we go, control is just an illusion, right? What can I really be certain of? Is there anything you can be certain of? I think there is one thing we can all be certain of. The trustworthiness of God. However, the temptation is always to pass up on the walk with God in the cool of the day and to replace it with the knowledge of good and evil. That's the ever-present temptation. The tempter is going, you don't need to trust God or be with him. Stop walking with him in the cool of the day and instead have the knowledge of right and wrong. Have the knowledge of good and evil. Because then you can determine what's right for you. And for some of us, we like to determine what's right for other people too. And this is where we have to approach this book with humility to make sure it's a pathway to get us to that walk in the garden rather than an idol that stops us from being with him. This is a great line. I can't remember who said it, but somebody once said, we use the Bible to solve our problems instead of using our problems to find God. Let me say that again. If we're not careful, we use the Bible just to solve our problems rather than letting our problems help us find God. When challenges come into our lives, some of us are like, I just got to go here so I can have resolve. I just want to get rid of the tension. As opposed to, wait, this challenge, this problem has come into my life for me to get to know God, not just to have a quick answer. It's for me to go deeper with him, for me to trust him more. Why? Because in my brokenness, I don't want to trust him. My default place, Paul calls this the flesh. Modern day, we typically call it the ego. That broken place in me is always going to pull me away from trust, away from relationship. The God of the universe is constantly romancing us and wooing us back into the deep mystery of him. This book either is a part of the joy of finding him, or it becomes the end in and of itself. That's usually when it's used as a club. It's not permeable. But this book is meant to go through to get to a relationship with God. We've all met the people that end here and they pick it up as a weapon. What do we do with this book? This beautiful, special, amazing book. I'll say a word about me. I was paying attention to trying to pay attention. What are the needs that are dominant in my life? When I am most in the rhythm of the kingdom, aligned with Christ, abiding in him, the Spirit alive in me, the two dominant needs, I've just watched for patterns in me. Now this is me, because this can be different than you. But the two dominant patterns for me are the two things that emerge are contribution and uncertainty. Contribution because in the Spirit, like my happy place, my place of great joy, is releasing other people to their God-given design. I love watching people get unstuck. I love seeing people live out some new calling. It gives me incredible joy. And I feel like I just get to contribute. That's a really healthy, good place for me when that's dominant in my life. The second piece is uncertainty. I actually love uncertainty. I love adventure. It's one of the reasons when we're like, hey, we're doing some mission thing, and they're like, who are we sending to the other part of the world? I'm like, so I'll go. I love being immersed in other cultures because I have no idea what's happening. And some of you are like, oh, dear God, I just got anxiety. Are you saying that? Certainty people, probably, right? That this uncertainty, when I'm really in that healthy place, I love it because I'm learning, I'm growing. It connects to some of those other needs. But ultimately, I'm really trusting in God. That's my really, really healthy place. The dominant places I go in my brokenness, by the way, and I'm giving you, I asked you the first example, you guys might do this exercise too. Where would you find yourself in rhythm with God and when you're in the flesh? In the flesh, I dominantly go to significance, growth, and certainty, which is really weird because I generally think I don't care for certainty, but I'll tell you how it takes me to certainty. I start to think significance is ultimately about will I be loved? That's all. Underneath significance is the question you're asking. So the significance goes, wait, will I be loved? And I need to grow more. I need to get more information, and then I'll feel certain. So this started probably a couple months ago. Thinking about the Bible series, I shared this with you maybe a couple, I don't know, maybe a month ago. I don't know how many weeks ago, but I shared it one Sunday. I was like, yeah, I'm thinking about this. I'm slightly terrified about this Bible series. Because, as I've said before, one of the unusual things about our church is a non-denominational church. There's so many. We did a survey at one point. It was like 57 different denominations are represented here, and lots of you have some really interesting, crazy stories about what you've come from. And so we all have we certainly have a different view on this book. And I'm thinking about entering this conversation and talking about it, and I got tripped up. My ego, flesh place started getting tripped up, and I started feeling anxiety. And the anxiety, ultimately, when I climbed underneath it was, will I be loved? And that's really the question I'm asking. And ultimately, I had to go, who am I? Is it a straw man? Is it somebody I'm making up? Is it kind of you as the congregation? Are there specific people in here? I mean, I'd really pay attention. Where is that anxiety coming from? So I went to see a mentor, a friend of mine, and being a great mentor, all she pretty much did was ask me questions. And so I'm like, yeah, I think I'm feeling some anxiety. She asked me some wonderful questions, and we got to this one point. She asked me a question, and I started to answer, and she goes, "Could you just stop with the intellectual stuff? Could you just tell me how you're experiencing God right now? Just get out of your head and get into your heart." And poof, it was like, in that moment, total peace. And it really, like, the peace that passes all understanding, the Prince of Peace, like those were the first phrases that kind of emerged in my mind. And I just had this sense of being one with God, as Jesus talks about. And I was like all was good with the world. I'm like, how long will this last? But I just had this place of feeling grounded and centered. And now the beauty is the spirit of that has really carried me over from the last several weeks, however long ago. And it kind of took all the anxiety away of, ultimately, I trust God in you and I trust God in me, that I'm going to show up in my own brokenness and do my best to present Scripture and what this is to the degree that I can. I've got great respect for this book. This book, by the way, just so we're all clear, has been used to heal the brokenhearted. And it's been used to start world wars. So let's understand the power of this book. So as I've thought about this, I'm like, okay, I will captain this voyage with a mixture of caution and enthusiasm. But I have some requests for you. Number one, so here, if we can make some agreements over the course of the next 3 months together, pay attention to what resonates with you and what feels weird. So if something resonates, you go, wow, gosh, something about, I don't even know if I understand it, but something about that feels really warm and feels right. I've actually always been looking for those words. Pay attention to that. If you go, that feels off. Something about that's weird for me. Would you pay attention to both? And would you pursue them both? Don't leave, we have 30 minutes together. Don't just leave it here. Pay attention and pursue. I'm asking you for the next 3 months. You probably need a journal or just have your phone app ready with your notes or whatever, because I'm going to need you to interact with me a little bit, or interact with the Spirit. And just pay attention, because the journey is for you to go, why is this resonating? This is the Spirit awakens what's written. These are just marks. Right? I mean, ultimately, we call them words, but they're just a bunch of, I mean, if you spoke, this is in English, and if I handed this to one of you who could not speak English, it would just be marks on a page. What makes it more than marks on a page? The meaning we give to it. Well, how is the meaning, what is the meaning to us? Well, it's, if you're in the Spirit, then you're awakened to understand truth. Truth represented in Jesus, ultimately in the Christ. And so I'm asking you to do some work. I'm not, if you haven't been, if you're new to Journey, this is probably, I should tell you this. If you've been here a long time, you get this. I'm not going to tell you what to believe. I'm going to offer, sometimes I'm going to probably even get up and be like, well, one group of people thinks this, one group of people thinks this. I'm going to present options for you. I'm going to tell you what theologians say. I'm going to just sometimes just going to read it and wonder together. But we're going to go on a journey to discover what this, you're like, man, I wanted the juicy stuff that people argue about on Facebook. We'll do some of that too, all right? That'll be good for me. We'll get it. We'll do some of the juicy stuff too. We'll get there. But we need to set the frame, make some agreements ahead of time, all right? So let's start here. I've given you this passage from Ezekiel as kind of a frame. And let me say this. I'm concluding today, but I'm really starting for the weeks ahead. Every time you open this book, it's a cross-cultural experience. So acknowledge that. A Middle Eastern book written by Middle Eastern people, dominantly to a Middle Eastern group. I like what Peter N. says. He says this, when we open the Bible and read it, we're eavesdropping on an ancient spiritual journey. That journey was recorded over a 1,000-year span of time by different writers, different personalities, different times, different circumstances, for different reasons. It doesn't work well as a point-by-point, exhaustive, and timelessly binding list of instructions about God and the life of faith. But it does work well as a model for our own spiritual journey. Now, if you're here today and you go, oh, this is already problematic for me, because I do see it as a point-by-point, exhaustive, timelessly binding list of instructions. If that's how you were taught, or that's what you believe, you're welcome. Just come and join us on the journey. My request would be just listen to the Spirit. There's a pretty good chance there aren't many of you here because you wouldn't be a journey that long. But if you are here and you see it that way, I want you to know you're welcome. It doesn't matter what position you take, where you are, this is the reason our church is called Journey Church. Wherever you are on the spectrum, you can consider yourself a left-leaning individual, a right-leaning individual. You can not like the terms left and right. You can like the word center. You can come up with whatever terminology you want, but whatever your position is on the Bible. We're going to walk in this in humility together. Jordan Peterson writes this. He says, we learn from our fellow human beings. And in this book, these are stories, and these stories are investigations into the structure of being itself. I love that. And calls to action within that being. So we're going to watch how human beings interact with one another. That's really what we do on a week-to-week basis. We read stories, watch how human beings interact with one another, and how they interact with God, and we learn from that, and then there are calls to action from within that being. Ultimately, there are stories of humans, but this is the story of God. And we, as mankind, we orient ourselves in His story. So I think this is probably an appropriate time to ask this question. If the Bible's not in your life, where are you getting your orientation? If this isn't in your life, maybe because you're like, I don't know what to do with it. Like, we're going to deal with a lot of the questions of the Old Testament. This Old Testament God seems different than the New Testament God. Why is that? We're going to talk about that. Perhaps you've put the book down because you're like, I don't get it. It doesn't make sense to me. And maybe that was the best thing for you because it would become a hindrance. If that's you, I want to encourage you to pick it back up again and pick it back up and go, what if I were to start with fresh eyes? And what if your prayer could be, God, would you pour into me new wine? Let me experience your Spirit anew. Can I put aside all the other stuff? Lloyd Ogilvie, who was an old English pastor, says this, prejudice has been defined as being down on what you are not up on. Meaning, we're prejudiced because we're not aware. Some of us have come to the Bible with a prejudice because there were just some things we didn't know. Some of us didn't know that the Bible was written to an honor and shame culture. That might be new news, and that might totally affect the trajectory of how you understand this book. There are some really, really simple things that sometimes you see them and you're like, oh, that was it? Wait, what? And it resolves so much of the things we don't understand. So would you be willing to come with fresh eyes and say, Spirit, just pour in this new wine in me. I want to walk in humility. I want to orient myself in your story. Would you take away any sense of fear or foreboding? And could I hold this book gingerly, not as a weapon or as a club, not as a platonic way of proving myself right, but rather think of it almost in a mystical sense, that the God of the universe plopped his journal in your lap and said, hey, read about me. I put my story in here. You're going to need some clues. Like, it's a discovery. It's a treasure hunt. You don't get to know it all at once. If I gave it to you all at once, it'd be a little bit like standing in front of the car and somebody flicking on the high beams. That would be painful. We actually have lots of stories about how the high beams got flicked on and people had trouble seeing God. Because you can't take him all in at once. We can't. We're these mortal creatures. But as our hearts are prepared, we expand in our understanding, knowledge, and relationship with him. Can this book be the pathway to a deeper relationship with God? It seems from our passage in Ezekiel that God is unwilling to be alone. He says to Ezekiel, stand up. I have something to tell you. Perhaps today, God is inviting you, like he did Ezekiel, into something deep, beautiful, and mysterious. Perhaps today, he has something to tell you. Would you bow your heads and close your eyes with me? Quick reflection before we move on. There's lots of things to say about the Bible, but if there's one overarching truth, it seems that this is a story of God constantly in search of man. When's the last time you walked with God in the garden, in the cool of the day? Which is just really a beautiful metaphor for saying, what's it like to go for a stroll and be loved? God's not interested in being alone. He's invited you into deep relationship with him. He's in search of you. Maybe as an action this week, would you just pay attention to those needs? What needs are dominating your existence? How might they affect your understanding and interaction with God? And might you dust off this book if it hasn't been opened in a while? Ask the Spirit to guide you. Perhaps pick one of the Gospels, one of those first 4 books in the New Testament that tell the stories of Jesus. Might not be a bad place to start. Then be with it again. Father, we acknowledge that we just recognize that bent in us to be our own God and not recognize that you indwell us. You are life itself. So tune us in to who you are. Align us in your spirit. Would you hear from your children that we come to you in a posture of humility, and then boldness of faith that steps forward into abundance. Order our steps as we go. Here are our prayers set to music. In Christ's name, amen.